Hey everyone, welcome to class 11, Spatial Archetypes and Real World Level Design. So 3 more weeks ago. So this week we're going to be looking at Architectural Approach to Level Design, Chapter 11, which is procedurally generated levels. We're going to be talking about Christopher Alexander's 15 fundamental properties of wholeness. That should be a significant challenge for everyone. And we're going to be looking at the video that you watched, or talking about the video you watched of Jesse Schell's talk on those 15 properties. He's specifically talking about game narrative. So if you haven't watched that yet, make sure that you do. It's really good and worth your time. And then lecture topics for the week, we're going to be talking about spatial archetypes, which are weird, but possibly useful, and looking a little bit at real world design and AR level design. In class activity, we're going to be, again, presenting some more patterns from your final projects, and we're going to be working on linking your patterns together, talking about parents and children. We're going to be doing pattern exercises for your, to create missing patterns that you still haven't acquired. And then we're going to be doing looking at the project for the week, which will be beginning the implementation of the final project in Engine. And your progress, what you've got in Engine, what you've done so far is what we're going to be looking at in class next week, like your initial design stuff. So let's get started. All right, so spatial archetypes. Let's talk about these. They're listed variously in slightly different ways, but spiral, circle, cross with a square in it, the pyramid shape, radiant axes, a grid, and a hyper network. So where do these come from, and how do they apply to both architecture and to level design? So they come from this person named Mimi Lavelle, who was a architect, philosopher, and second wave feminist scholar. And her thoughts in a lot of ways are pretty out there. She's not necessarily hugely everybody didn't buy into this concept, but I think it's pretty interesting. She was taking a lot of the work from different fields, cross-disciplinary work, looking at, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey kind of stuff, looking at Jung and how the human psyche might possibly work. And then also looking at architecture and archaeology and saying what kind of buildings were people creating at different times, and how might that relate to their worldview and spirituality and conception of what's going on in the world. So not necessarily that these things spiritually cause these people to build in this way, or there is some deep intrinsic human connection to the universe that causes this kind of architecture, but more like when a society of people believes this kind of thing or has this conception of the universe, they tend to build in this kind of way. And so she looked at the sort of progress and history of architecture in the world and what those shapes were, and came up with a rough breakdown like this. So saying that hunter-gatherer societies built in spirals and had a lot of she says sensitive chaos. Their buildings were very shaped by their immediate environment and their immediate needs. That in Neolithic era, largely she thought formed by goddess worship, people were building in great rounds, in connected circles. That in the Bronze Age, when you had warrior tribes, and early city-state kind of things going on, early group gatherings, people started dividing things into 4 quarters. The world of the hero was sort of, there's a central figure here, and this is your domain. And then pyramids started showing up when you have nation states that are hierarchical. The idea that we talked about hierarchy in architecture last week, say ordering principle, that this sort of manifested in pyramid shapes. And then as we got to empire, we started having radiate axes, like, roads spreading out from a center in all directions in a, representation of imperialism. That when we hit capitalism and the age of commerce, that we started building in grids, and you have, so this is industrial revolution, that things are being organized in a grid. And then now, as we have a deeply connected world of the internet, people have added on to that, saying that hyper networks are then sort of the next stage in that development. But then she also looked at sort of architectural chaos that comes when empire collapses, and dissolution as sort of late stage capitalism, maybe. So that's all interesting. And, maybe there's some truth there, maybe not. but you do look back and see all those different styles of architecture in roughly that order, throughout history. So if you're trying to create a, early man Neolithic kind of hunter-gatherer society, you don't want to organize any, settlements into grids, because that's not how people were building at that time period. So roughly looking, these are useful in terms of establishing what the architectural layout of your spaces is, depending on what sort of era of human development you're talking about. So that's all possibly useful to us, however, factually true it might be. All right, real world and AR level design. So we've talked a lot about how you would design levels in games if you are, constructing a virtual space. And we've talked some about how you would structure real world spaces, right? If you're actually building a house, if you're actually building a city or a town, if you're building a level in a game, if you're building a town in a game, what would those look like? But what do you do when your game takes place in the real world? There are sort of two cases now where you see that a lot in game design. One of those is in live action role-playing game design. Now, that's somewhat specialized and pretty geeky, but a lot of game designers do participate in that kind of design. And we have quite a bit of expertise here at Northeastern in terms of looking at how people interact in live action role-playing games, how that works. I've produced a number myself and participated in many, including probably the most powerful gaming experiences I've had have been in that kind of environment. Also, a lot of really lame ones, but that's how games are. We make a lot of bad ones. That's why we're in this class, to do better. But also, Celia Pierce has a lot of expertise in this area, has created a lot of live action games of different various experimental kinds. I believe Brandon is also participates in this type of gameplay and design. So a lot of resources about this, and we've thought about it amongst the faculty quite a bit. So talking about two different games that I built. One isn't a live action game or an AR game, actually, but it is a real world game. So in college, my game designer friends and I created a series of what we called theater games, which were not necessarily games that you played for theatrical training, but were games that we played in the physical theater of our university because it had really good level design. The game, the Vampire Hunter game, which we created, was essentially a complicated game tag in which one player played a vampire that was holed up in his lair, and everyone else played vampire hunters who were going into seek out and destroy the vampire. And in that game, you had hide and go seek, but then you also had the vampire could only be destroyed together the three holy relics. So the vampire took three items and hid them in the theater. They had to be in a space where they could be seen without moving anything. In the whole theater building, the vampires went to find those things, and if they could gather them and bring them to the stage, they could then hunt the vampire. If the vampire tagged you while you were doing that, then you screamed and fell down, laid there for 60 seconds, and rose as another vampire and helped him hunt the other players. So it was a good game design. It was a really fun game to play, but it wouldn't have worked anywhere. It worked very well in the space that we chose for it because that space was, very much a rhizome, right? Like you could get from any place in the theater to any other place by a number of different possible paths. It was very non-linear. It contained a lot of different individual spaces. It contained several big prospect spaces. The prop shop was this large room. The actual theater space itself was a large open room. It contained a lot of hallways. It contained, dead ends. And so there were all of these, game design features that we've talked about present in this building. And therefore, we were able to design a game that would function well in that space. We designed a variety of different games that all worked in that kind of a way. So if you are creating a game, think about what kind of space it requires. What's the gameplay like, right? That could be designing a football field or baseball field or a paintball arena or, a archery tag arena or, the kind of spaces that you find created in Bodeborg in Boston, which is a sort of like an escape room kind of space, but with a lot more physical activity often required for different games. And all of the spaces that they create for each game in their facility uses a different kind of space. So physical real world space design is a thing that you may end up doing as a game designer. How do you make use of existing space? How do you design games for that space? And then if you have a game, what kind of space would it require, right? And how would you do that physically in a reasonable way? So Vampire Hunter is an example of taking advantage of existing space. Live action role-playing games. So Days End is another game that I created. In that game, everyone is trapped on the eve of a zombie apocalypse in a single room. I set the game variously in a open visit weekend for university, and all of the players are trapped in a university classroom. And so the game was played at a festival at a university in a classroom, right? So I set the game in the same place as the game was going to be played in to reduce the cognitive load of imagining the space by actually, putting people in that space. And then I set up that space in order to encourage players to break up into smaller groups to interact with each other. There were 16 players, and I placed groups of 2 or 3 chairs or some pillows on the floor together, but only a few of them, to encourage the players to not just all sit together and solve the problem, but to break up and form factions and so on. There were a lot of elements in that game that caused the players to distrust each other, not be certain whose agenda was what, and give them reasons to not want to be around the rest of the players and to seek either isolation or small group contact. And that was facilitated by the physical space design. And so that every time I've run the game, I've given it a slightly different setting that matches where it's going to be run. A conference room at a hotel, with draggable walls so that the space could be divided into subspaces. Then turning the lights on in one space and off in another space to create different mood for feelings of quiet and isolation or open group contact. So creating the kind of space that these games needed within the environments that I was setting the game in is important. All right, and then looking at the fact that physical spatial design doesn't necessarily just involve the actual structure of the space. There's a game called White Death in which a dozen or so players play explorers who have been trapped in the snow somewhere, and they are slowly freezing to death. In that game, everybody dies. It is fantastic. If you ever have an opportunity to play it, it is hands down the best designed game I've ever played, full stop, digital or physical. Brilliant game design. Its use of space is almost entirely abstract. The players are trapped by their need for warmth, and the livable space is represented by a spotlight that is shined on the floor, sometimes up against a wall, sometimes in the middle of a room. All of the lights are turned out in the room, so it's pitch black except for the spotlight, and the players can't leave the spotlight or they freeze to death. Periodically, that space shifts as different things happen in the game. Different kinds of resources are made available to them, represented by things like balloons that represent their hope. So white balloons will appear in another circle of light nearby, that's barely connected to the one they're in, and you can slip out and grab a balloon and bring it back. Food is represented by little white cupcake containers with either coconut or white sprinkles in them that appear in a different circle. I don't know, there's 3 different things that happen. One is sheets of paper that maybe represent your life or future or something. Not super important what exactly it was, but the space shifts, you move out, the space begins to fade in that area, everyone retreats back. And then, at the very end of the game, when everyone has to die every so many minutes, but it's your choice who it's going to be. People individually walk into the darkness and are taken up by other players. Once you are dead, you're freed of all of your human limitations, represented by cards you've drawn that require you to do things like, always have one hand touching the ground, or always keep your hands 2 feet apart, to, always have your feet higher than your hands, things like that, in really weird ways. Those limitations are removed from you when you die. You're draped in a white cloth and you can dance around the edge of the light while the other people finish playing the game. Game's 1 hour long. And at the very end, when the last person is leaving the light, they're stepping out of the light and the light's fading to blackness as they walk into the freedom of death and darkness. So really abstract game, really intense emotionally, pairing of physical mechanics with a thematic gameplay, great use of sound. There's music playing throughout the whole thing that's very carefully chosen. But all of the space is created by light. And so light is the architecture of that game space. It's very abstract and incredibly emotionally powerful. Looking at AR games, there are a number of different considerations. You look at something like Pokemon Go and where can you safely place in-game locations? Their answer to that was, well, let's look at public art, because public art is sort of intrinsically accessible, and we're going to place our gameplay nodes in those public locations so we know people will be able to access them. We're going to spawn Pokemon, but we're not going to do that as much on private property. We're going to avoid doing that in the middle of streets because we're using Google Maps so we know where those things are. There was a similar game that was coming out before Harry Potter Wizards Unite came out that was called Magus. That was everybody's playing Wizards in a Modern World kind of thing. It was a successful Kickstarter that then failed to produce all of its promises, and people ended up pretty cross at them, although they put forward a good faith effort and did create a game. Like, they didn't throw everyone over, they just failed to deliver on everything that they wanted to do, because game designers, one of the challenges they faced was the idea that they were going to have dungeons in the game where you and a group of other people could get together and have a dungeon crawl kind of experience in the real world. The challenge they faced was, you couldn't just say everybody shows up at this location and then we're going to use street maps to say, go down this street, turn right, go down this street, turn left, go down this street, and there'll be a boss fight there. That seems to work relatively well, but the game designers just don't have the capacity to understand what streets are safe to walk down and which ones aren't. So that could encourage players to walk into danger, right? And they wanted to avoid sending some group of people playing late at night into the Tenderloin in San Francisco, where they then get mugged. Rough neighborhood. So how do you work on that kind of design? How do you create a spatial progression when you don't have any control over what space that's going to be played in? And their working design at the time that the game ended was that it was distance-based, right? You're going to get together and you have to travel a certain distance. And every so often, as you're traveling distance, you're going to have encounters wherever you happen to be going. You get to pick that at your comfort level. So that works pretty well. In Pokemon Go, they turned some of those pieces of public art into control points that different factions in the game could take them over. But largely that doesn't feel like it matters very much. You get resources for taking over a node, a Pokemon gym, and that feels like it matters. It feels good to be in control of a gym. But largely, like, if I'm in control of a gym and getting my points for the day, I don't really care about who controls what other gyms where, right? So like, the global territory control doesn't feel like it really matters at all. As opposed to the physical game, geolocated game Ingress by Niantic. Territory control does feel like it matters, right? The struggle between the two factions is the core and primary focus of that game. And it feels like it matters a lot as the nodes connect to each other, and globally you get points based on how much territory your group controls, and you get points based on how many triangles of space you control. That dominates the game. It's very important for the game, and for the different groups within the game who controls what, and that creates interesting political maneuverings and so on, but also it can create very high levels of involvement and responsibility for controlling an area, and that's led to a lot of not tremendously healthy gameplay habits for people playing the game. So these are the kind of things that we're starting to look at as we're doing AR design. And if you move into that area of design, you're going to be thinking about how do I augment or expand on the spaces that I'm using in augmented reality, and how do I keep players safe? How do I make their interactions meaningful? How do I connect the content of the game to the specific location that the players are in a way that makes that location feel actually like it's relevant to the game and not like it's just wherever you happen to be. Those are not solved problems, but I bring them up because they are the problems that you all will be solving as you move into the industry, at least if you work in any of these physical areas. All right. So in class today, we're going to be linking patterns together. So I want to lecture a little bit on what we mean by those things, so that you'll be prepared for these exercises. So linking patterns, we're going to be looking at parent and child patterns. And you've linked some of your patterns already to parents and children, but now you're explicitly needing to go out and do that. And do that again now that you've created more keywords and more patterns. So in this case, you're going to be looking for parent patterns and child patterns. Parent patterns are if one pattern is required for another pattern to function, then the required pattern is the parent. So if pattern 1 needs pattern 2 in order to work, pattern 2 is the parent of pattern 1. Or when one pattern is a more general version of another pattern. And I'll give an example of each of those. So an example parent child pair would be if a pattern about character progression, how character progression creates a sense of mastery in the player would be a parent, and a pattern about how using character abilities to unlock new areas in the game world would be a child of that parent, right? Because you can't talk about unlocking new areas in the game world by granting the character new abilities if there's no progression in player abilities, right? The progression is a prerequisite for the progression having a particular effect in the game world. So again, child patterns are symmetrically to parent patterns, patterns that require another pattern in order to function, or that are a more specific instance of another pattern. So an example of that second kind of hierarchy, a pattern about using movement to create a sense of player autonomy, which I misspelled there, that would be a parent, and a child would be a pattern about increasing a player's jump ability in order to expand traversal possibilities and increase the player's sense of autonomy, right? So using jump specifically is a specific case of movement in the game. Therefore, the movement pattern would be the parent and the jumping pattern would be the child. So that's the basic concept. Now, not all patterns are related in this strict parent-child kind of a way. Sometimes, patterns may, so rather than extending this and talking about cousin patterns or something like that, I'm going to drop the parent-child metaphor and just talk about the other kinds of patterns. Additive patterns are patterns that improve the function of another pattern. They're not necessary for it, but if you have one pattern, then another one will add to it. Often they're siblings, they both have the same parent. So you might be trying to increase player autonomy. You might be using that jumping pattern, but then you might also be using a ability to find more and more powerful weapons to create the same sense of player autonomy. They both happen to be related to progression, but using those together is more effective than just using one of them if you're trying to create player autonomy through progression. So those would be patterns that are additive to each other. Alternative patterns are patterns that both achieve the same kind of goal, but don't really work together. You want to do one of them or the other one, right? And that might be, patterns about camera perspective. You're going to pick probably one or another camera perspective for your game, and there might be two perspectives that both achieve the same kind of an effect, but you're going to pick one or the other of those. So those would be alternative patterns, one or the other. They both do the same, they're similar things, but you don't want to use them both at one time because they'll muddy the waters or be less effective. And then you have subtractive or anti-patterns. And in that case, subtractive patterns are patterns that make another pattern less effective. You might say, well, that sounds bad. I don't want to make my patterns less effective. I want to make them more effective. Well, not necessarily. Again, with the player progression concept, the more power you give the character in the game, the more autonomy the player feels. But if you do that all at once, then the player has no sense of progression, and they're just suddenly way too powerful and the game's unbalanced. And so you might use a pattern that's about limiting player power by creating environmental factors that make their powers, less effective or less useful. And you're using that to balance the game. So subtractive patterns are often things you introduce to reduce the overpoweredness or the effectiveness of one pattern by mitigating it with another one. So those are useful. Also, those could be seen as a kind of anti-pattern because they are reducing the effectiveness of something. We also look at, in the book, there's a section about looking for bad patterns, right? Patterns that cause a negative effect that you don't want in your game, things you would want to avoid. Largely, I'm trying to focus or to avoid focusing on those kind of patterns in general. It's important to identify what things are bad and why they're bad. But having a vast list of don'ts is less useful than having a list of do's. And so the patterns that we're working on are about what you want to do. The patterns that are, if you do this kind of thing, it has this negative effect, don't do that. Yes, those are patterns. Yes, you can use them. When you find one of those, though, it's more useful to see if you can frame that in, reverse the structure of that pattern to talk about how you can solve a problem with something other than what a negative problem is. All right, and we've done a bunch of work on keywords, and keywords are important to capture what about a pattern is, so that to capture what a pattern is about and to make them easily searchable. So that's great. So patterns also, create sort of discrete and ways to categorize your patterns. And what you want to do now that you are looking at these parent-child connections is look at the keywords of parents and children. And if the two patterns are related, do they share any keywords? If they don't currently share any keywords, should they? If you identify something as a parent of your pattern, are there keywords that it has that you're like, oh, actually, yes, my pattern could have that keyword? Well, you want to be adding those keywords as you go through and do these parent and child exercises. Assess the keywords of each and propagate keywords that should be shared to link them together in more ways. Awesome. All right, we're now going to, in class, present the patterns that you're working on so far. And we'll talk a little bit about how they relate to each of your overall game designs. So, I'm going to have the group give that brief initial game design description and then talk about the patterns that they've added now that we started linking things together in order to support that nascent design. Your readings and discussion, we're going to go over chapter 11. We're going to talk about the lecture. There'll be more detail there. We'll talk about the 15 properties of wholeness in terms of architecture in the real world, game narrative. Do they fit in other aspects of game design? And look a little at, are there other properties that might be out there? Your exercises will be linking parent patterns, linking child patterns, and then looking for other relationships that might exist in all of your patterns. Lastly, individually, you're going to be looking for finding missing patterns in our larger pattern or in the pattern language. So in that case, you're going to look through all of the exercises, or sorry, all of the patterns that your team has selected for your project, and then you're going to see if any of them don't have parents and children. And if that is the case, then each of you is going to pick one of those and is going to create a parent or child pattern using this finding missing patterns exercise. Again, that will be in chapter 14 in the book if you want to look for the example, how to work through that, because this is a little hard. And then it's 159 is the result of that in the pattern library. All right, your project assignment for the week is going to be to look at the other pattern relationships that you create in class, look at the new patterns that you each group member created, and see if those are ones you want to adopt into your project. You're then going to look at the parent and child you identified, see if those are relevant. When you've completed the list of patterns you want to use for your project, you're then going to start applying those patterns to your design. So you have that initial design you were working on. Now you're going to incorporate in any new patterns, see how do they change and affect the design. And, ideally you'll have your initial design and then you'll say, we added these patterns. Our new design is different in these ways because now it incorporates these new patterns. And this is how they have informed and altered that design. I would love to see that change in your initial design to design incorporating new patterns reflect how the new patterns work. If you didn't find any new patterns, if your new patterns didn't shift your design at all, then that's an interesting piece of data for me and for you. But hopefully there will be an adjustment in your design to accommodate the new patterns. And hopefully that makes your design better. All right, and then you're going to begin implementing your scene once you have gotten to that point, and make careful note of what patterns you are using in this scene or the scene that you're creating, and how those patterns are implemented, right? Again, taking screenshots, doing your gray boxing stage, showing how your patterns are all incorporated. There's going to probably be more screenshots and more detail here than in previous projects because you're using a larger number of patterns. And so you need to show where all of those patterns are present in your design using this, your keyshots or screenshots and documentation. All right, and lastly, the assignment for the week will be to write a paragraph in response to the readings as normal. This time we're looking at chapter 12. There's a little article on rational game design. That's really important. It's sort of a non sequitur, but it's really good stuff. You want to read that. And you want to read chapter 13 in Pattern Language for Game Design, which talks specifically about applying those 15 principles to game design and what that looks like. So this is sort of the culmination of last week's reading. Again, record your work on exercises 25, 26, 27. Do exercise 28 independently. You may or may not work on it in class, but you need to have it done as soon as you can so your groups can start using that content and have discussed it before class next week. So don't wait to do and turn in exercise 28 until bring it to class. Otherwise, you won't have time to have incorporated those patterns. And I'm going to be looking for that in your discussion next week. Again, you're going to begin your final project implementation in Engine finally, and you're going to prepare a presentation of where you're at for class next week. All right, I will see you in class this week. If I can stop the recording.